All right. Today we're going to continue, and actually we conclude our series, God and Sexuality. For those of you who have not been with us throughout the series, the first week we tackled the issue of relativism and sexuality and talked about how, we're in a season right now, a month right now, that the culture is talking about Pride Month, right? LGBTQ plus, and so there's a lot of conversation about sex and sexuality and the ways that it ought to and should be expressed. In the first week, we asked the question, we've continued to ask the question as we've gone along each week, is what the culture telling us really the truth? Because the culture communicates in such a way as, this is the truth. This is the way that our sexuality ought to be expressed. This is the way that it ought to, or that it actually, in fact, does work. We saw from Romans chapter 1 that Paul told us that people suppress the truth and they exchange the truth for lies. And we kind of came to the conclusion that through the writings of the Apostle Paul, that's what's going on in culture. Culture is exchanging truth. They're suppressing the truth so as they can satisfy and gratify their own desires. Which the second week we looked at the deviation in sexuality and how we as people, all of us, go astray. We go our own way. We go after the satisfaction, the pursuing of our own desires, which often are rooted in the sin nature, the flesh. And it takes us in destructive and negative ways. Last week, we looked at identity and sexuality. LGBTQ plus all kind of gets into the notion of multiple ways that culture is telling us that we can express our sexual identity. All those messages are available on our church website, along with all the PowerPoints. You can always go to the church website to find the teaching, including the PowerPoints from those messages. Today, we talk about sex and sexuality. There is an innate desire, a drive, a strong desire, a passionate force within all of us as people. That desire wants to be experienced, it wants to be expressed, it wants to be felt. We begin to identify these strong desires while we're young, somewhere around 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years, we begin to recognize within us that we have a desire for something. We're not fully aware at that age what that's about, but we know that images stimulate something within us, whether it's an image that's seen on a screen, whether it's what we see in terms of when we see people. It may be sounds, it may be words, it may be lyrics, it may be the sound of music that touches something inside of us, that stimulates a desire. It may be a touch. But all of these stimuli, we begin to recognize them at an early age. And, in today's culture with the access to a screen, right, where we have screens in our hands all of the time, and with 4.5 million porn websites, it's highly likely that most of us who are growing up today are beginning to experience those sexual feelings when we first see the image of a naked person on a screen. Nat Nanny tells us that the average age of first-time exposure to pornography is 11 years old. If you're growing up in Massachusetts, and in particular in the Boston school system, you have the opportunity in high school to take a porn literacy class, a class to help you navigate porn. The New York Times Magazine 2018 February issue records this: teenagers consume a large amount of pornographic media at the same time that they are developing ideas about their sexual identity and preferences. A porn literacy class offered to Boston high school students helps them to better understand the dynamics of what it is that they are seeing. Another thing that these students would experience in a porn literacy class is the introduction to language like sex positive. Sex positive. This is a term that's been around for a little while, definitely throughout the 60s and the sexual revolution, but most recently, Dr. Carol Queen, a sexologist, writer, author, activist, she defines sex positive in this way. She says sex positive is a simple yet radical affirmation that we each grow our own passions on a different medium, that instead of having 2 or 3 or even a half dozen sexual orientations, we should be thinking in terms of millions. Sex positive respects each of our unique sexual profiles, even as we acknowledge that some of us have been damaged by a culture that tries to eradicate sexual difference and possibility. You see, what it is that culture keeps teaching us, and in particular our young teens, is that they have an innate drive, a sexual drive that desires to be fulfilled, that desires to be satisfied. And as an individual with these desires, they ought to pursue the satisfaction that experience those desires in any and every way, up to even 1,000,000 different ways. Talking further about what children and adults even experience in regard to pornography, in an article that appeared in April of 2018 in New York Times, Maureen Dowd is interviewing Joanna Coles. Joanna Coles is the former editor of Cosmopolitan. She wrote a book, but she was interviewing her, and she says this. She says there's a new sense in which young women feel that they are now in competition with porn. And if they don't put out, it's easy for the guy to go home, log into porn, and get what he needs. Cole says the young women are sublimating their own needs to try and please the guy. Then they realize that their needs weren't being met at all. Men, women have these innate desires, right? These sexual desires that want to be expressed, that want to be experienced, that want to be felt. And each person, man or woman, should go ahead and fulfill those sexual desires. You know, culture's view of sex is that sex is really no different than any other drive, right? If you are thirsty, grab a soda, a water, a beer. If you're hungry, have some chips, a burger, a salad, a piece of chicken. If you're feeling sexual, have sex with whomever, whenever you choose to express and gratify that desire that you have for it to be felt. This is what culture is telling us. This is the message that you hear over and over, right? This is what we hear day in and day out through movies, through lyrics, through politicians and their viewpoint. Over and over and over and over. This is the message that we hear. You have desires, fulfill them any way that you want. As I've been thinking about this message, and in particular, all the stuff that I've been reading over the past few weeks and from the world, from culture, I wrote this in my notes. I wrote, there is another vision for sex. There is another vision for sex, but it's not based on your sexual freedom. It's not based on satisfying and pleasing your own sexual desire, but rather it's a vision of sex that is about pleasing God and pleasing your spouse, which will then satisfy you. You see, sex is not about you. Sex is not about you. It's not about satisfying your pleasure. Sex is about serving. It's about satisfying and pleasing the most important persons in life, God and your spouse. Now, where do you get that from, Kirk? Well, I get that from Scripture. And we're going to dig into 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, and there's lots of places in the biblical text that we could look that kind of give us this vision for sex. But some people, when they hear of God or think of the church talking about sex, they have a negative view about sex. Or they think that God is against sex, that God doesn't like sex. And to be fair, that mentality somewhat has come from how the church has talked about sex. For example, starting way back, the early days in the life of the church, there is a church father by the name of Augustine. We quote him often. Deep thinker, fantastic theologian, terrible theology about sex. In his book, The Challenge of the Disciplined Life, Reflections on Money, Sex, and Power, Richard Foster writes this. He says, perhaps no one did more to bring these terrible teachings about sex into the heart of the church than Augustine. No doubt his own sexual escapades as a youth helped to account for his negative attitude toward sexuality after his conversion. And in The City of God, it's a book I have on my shelf, he refers to the shame which attends all sexual intercourse. Foster goes on to say, even within marriage, he saw sexual relationships, except for the sake of begetting children, to be venial sin. Other early theologians, Foster goes on to say, had even further views, right? Many theologians, however, went on further than Augustine. Some warned couples that the Holy Spirit left the bedroom whenever they engaged in sex. So this guy, Ives of Karts, counseled the devout to abstain from sexual intercourse on Thursdays in remembrance of Christ's rapture, on Fridays in remembrance of Christ's crucifixion, on Saturdays in honor of the Virgin Mary, on Sundays in commemoration of Christ's resurrection, and on Mondays out of respect for the departed souls. And so if you were alive in the early couple hundreds, the teaching that you would hear from the church was very negative about sex. These theologians missed something. They misunderstood something. They really missed what God has to say about our sexuality. And how, in fact, that God, the designer of people, which we talked about last week, right, that there is the identity of maleness and femaleness, and that the man would leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two would become one flesh. That right from the very beginning, in the way in which that God designed people, he designed them with sexual interest, sexual desire. God made us that way. Sex is a beautiful thing. It's a good thing in the context of marriage. That is God's vision for sex. And we're going to see that this morning in 1 Corinthians 6. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to open up to 1 Corinthians 6. We're going to look at 6 and then into chapter 7. We're going to begin at verse 12 and work through chapter 7. But before we go there, just a brief word about the city of Corinth. Right? The book we're looking at is Corinthians. The Apostle Paul, you've heard me say this many times, the Apostle Paul is undisputed as a historical figure. There isn't an atheist, there isn't any scholar anywhere who denies that Paul exists. And they all accept that he wrote the book of 1 Corinthians. There's so much documentation, so much historical evidence. to it. And this is what Paul writes to the church in Corinth. Now, Corinth was a real city, the ruins of which you can go to today. Corinth was no different really than our culture today, with maybe the exception that they had actually a temple of worship in which sex was lived out with prostitutes. And so we have the Greek geographer and historian Strabo, who tells us this. He says, the temple of Aphrodite was once so rich that it had acquired more than 1,000 prostitutes, donated by both men and women to the service of the goddess. And because of them, the city used to be jam-packed and became wealthy. The city captains could spend fortunes there. And so the proverb says, the voyage to Corinth isn't for just anyone. It's interesting, this was written in 20 AD. Who's alive in 20 AD in Israel? Jesus, right? And so Jesus is on the planet. He's walking the earth. At the same time, Corinth is participating and worshiping the goddess of Aphrodite and expressing their desires by having sex with the prostitute in worship to the goddess, in hopes that by participating in this act, the goddess would bless them, would cause them to be fruitful, that they would have many children, that their animals would be incredibly fruitful, that their fields would be productive. And so they were using sex in worship, right? They're using God. They're using spiritual practices in order to get what it is that they want. And of course, the satisfaction of the body's response in a sexual act. See, culture has been all about this. Culture is always about this, right? Culture has always had this message. Sex is for yourself. Go ahead and gratify it and satisfy it in any way that you want. Paul writes to a culture just like ours when he writes these words. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. He says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Food for the stomach, and the stomach for food. But God will destroy them both. The body is not meant for sex? No, the body is not meant for sexual immorality or porneia. Porneia, the Greek word, means sexual sin of a general kind that includes many different kinds of behavior. The body is not meant for sex being satisfied in any way in which you want. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Listen to how many times body is mentioned. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them in worship like you Corinthians do at the temple of Aphrodite with a prostitute? No, never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? Doesn't that sound familiar to what you heard in Genesis in the beginning, right? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But he who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Therefore, because of all this, Church of Corinth, flee from porneia. Flee from sex in any way in which you want. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside of his body. But he who sins sexually sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. Skipping verse 1 of chapter 7, and jumping to verse 2, since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. And in the same way, the husband body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. So do not deprive each other, except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. See, Paul gives us these words not to produce any kind of guilt or shame or condemnation, or to say that sex is bad in some way, but instead to inform us, to instruct us, and to direct us to a healthy and godly living. His goal is not to demean sex, but instead to elevate sex. He's not diminishing sex, rather he is protecting sex and the hearts and the minds and the bodies of men and women as we participate in sex in the husband and wife committed relationship. Culture says your body is your body. Your desires are your desires, and you are free to meet those desires how you choose. God says your body is not your body. Your body belongs to God and to your spouse. Your desires are met not by satisfying yourself, but rather by pleasing God with your body and by pleasing your spouse by giving your body to your spouse. Culture says you first. You satisfy yourself. God says make him first and love your spouse as much as you love yourself, and then your desires will be fulfilled. Sex is not about you. Sex is not about serving, or sex is about serving, satisfying, and pleasing the most important people in life, God and your spouse. So this leads me to make these two statements. First, sex is not about pleasing yourself. Sex instead is about pleasing God. Right? Sex is not about pleasing yourself. Sex is about pleasing God. How we manage our body, the things that we do with our body. We must understand that our body is not our own, right? We don't own it and possess it simply alone, independently. We're not alone in it. God lives within us, right? And so there were several phrases that stick out as you read through 1 Corinthians 6:13 to the end of the chapter there, right? The body is for the Lord. Your bodies are members of Christ himself. If you are united with the Lord, you are one with him in spirit. Your body is a temple. It's a house. It's a place in which the Holy Spirit lives and dwells. See, the idea is simply this. You have a body. God's given you a body. God's created you, male and female. God's designed your body, the physical body as well as the immaterial part of your body, in such a way. God is the designer. He's the creator. He knows the way that you work. He understands the complexity, and he made you complex. He made you with thoughts, with emotions and with feelings, including the sexual feelings. This was God's idea. This is a good thing. But because he knows, he gives us warnings. He tells us this is the way that it works. If you don't follow the way that it works, you're going to experience some negative things. You see, why does God give us this instruction? Because God made sex spiritual as well as physical, right? He knows that the two must go together. The phrase, do you not know that he unites himself with a prostitute, is one with her in body. The word unite, the Greek word means to glue or to join together. It means to join oneself, to become a part. You take Gorilla Glue, you take wood glue, and you glue two pieces of wood together, you clamp them together, and they are bound, they are stuck. That's why we got glue, so it fixes the things that we break, or so that we can create a bigger board. But that's what glue does, it sticks us together. God designed sex physically and spiritually so that when we express the sexual desires, there's something not only physical that's happening, that's being connected together, but there's something spiritual that's happening and something spiritual, emotional that's being connected together. God knows this. God tells us this. God warns us about it. Now, what's interesting is perhaps the best illustrations to teach us that this is the way things really work, and if we don't do things God's way, it hurts, are people who don't do what God says. And so I'm just going to read for you from the words of many, from different articles that I've read over the past week. But here's one from the New York Times, again, referencing the article that I referenced earlier, what's lust got to do with it. And so here's what Lauren says. She says, getting naked and having sex with strangers is hard. We portray it as fun, and we pretend it is fun. But people crave intimacy, which is not easy to create in a hookup. So she's talking all about the hookup culture. And actually she's saying is that this practice in which people just hook up with each other just simply for sex really doesn't work very good. It's not really very healthy. We don't get what it is that we really want out of it because people crave intimacy. It's interesting, isn't it? There's somebody who's practicing this, participating in this, interviewed lots of people on this, and is telling us sex is best in the context of a committed relationship. In an article that appeared just back in April in the New York Times, Christine Emba, straight people need better roles for sex. She writes this is very fascinating. Navigating our love lives has always been difficult, but today the general outlook has come to take on a less playful, more depressive tone, expressed in the form of regret, embarrassment, and hopelessness. These are the words used to talk about the sexual experience. Regret, embarrassment, hopelessness. This pessimism, listen to this next sentence. This pessimism comes at a moment when we might expect it to be the exact opposite. Why? Because we are in the golden age of sexual freedom. And then she goes on and she talks all about what that means. But then coming back to her conclusion, we have breached the ramparts of repression. But an unrestrained sexual culture hasn't necessarily led to better sex. In many cases, it has inspired numbness, callousness, hurting others, and being hurt. And rather than being titillating, sexual overload has become boring. This next piece, I highly recommend you read the entire article. I placed the website address to it. This is of a young college student, Leah Fessler, who writes of her time in Middlebury College, in which she invested her whole thesis after going through her junior or her freshman, sophomore, and junior year, living in a hookup culture. She invests her whole senior thesis by interviewing over 300 students on campus to find out what they felt like in regards to the hookup culture. Here's what she describes. She says, this is how it works. Two students consistently hook up with one another, and typically only each other, for weeks, months, even years. Yet, per unspoken social code, neither party is permitted emotional involvement, commitment, or vulnerability. It's just sex for sex, right? Go ahead, satisfy your sexual desires. This is what you're supposed to do, especially in college. You're free now. Go for it. With time, she writes, inevitably, this is what happened. She's talking personally. With time, inevitably, came attachment. And with attachment came shame, anxiety, and emptiness. My girlfriends and I, we were top students, scientists, artists, and leaders. We could advocate for anything except for our own bodies. We won accolades from our professors, but the men we were sleeping with wouldn't even eat breakfast with us the next morning. We were desperate to know what it felt like to be wanted, desperate for a chance at intimacy, desperate for a hand held in daylight. And then she goes on, and this is kind of a conclusion of this article. She says, to attempt to separate emotions from sex is not only illogical, given that emotional intensely augments pleasure, but also impossible for almost all women. The truth is that for many women, there's nothing liberating about emotionless, non-committal sex. And in her survey, or in her research, she found that 100% of all the women that she talked to said that hookup sex didn't do it. 100% of them were dissatisfied with it. She goes on to say that men's experience with hookup culture are equally complex. It's worth noting that the vast majority of males I interviewed and surveyed also ideally preferred committed relationships. You see, the best illustrators are those who are practicing this. It's a lie, people. I mean, it's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie. This is what the culture tells us. And yet, even when the culture begins to talk about it, they still are trying to figure out ways to keep having sex with whomever they want to try and satisfy their desires, yet it doesn't work. They don't understand that sex is not about pleasing themselves, it's about pleasing God and understanding the way that He designed us. Secondly, sex is not about pleasing yourself, sex is about pleasing your spouse. It's not about satisfying yourself, it's about satisfying your spouse. See what Paul says in verse 3 of chapter 7. He says, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Duty, boy, that sounds negative, doesn't it? It's not negative. It's a responsibility. It's something that you owe to, not in a negative way. It's not negative. The tone isn't negative in the original in any way. It's your responsibility. The wife's body does not belong to her alone. Alone. Yes, it's her body, but it doesn't belong to her alone. Her body also belongs to her husband. The husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. It's not his alone. See, sex is for the satisfaction, the pleasure of your spouse. This is how God designed it. God designed sex to be an act of serving, of expressing love and intimacy to your spouse. Anytime sex is done for your own pleasure, it comes up short. Culture tells us over and over and over. So this is Leah's conclusion. She says, at the very end of this article, she writes, if we taught pleasure-centric sex ed beginning in middle school and high school and all the way through college, I can only imagine the possibilities. Young women who are only beginning to explore physical intimacy would go in armed with the knowledge that emotionless casual sex is likely to be radically dissonant with their body's desires. And men would know that it's their responsibility to care about women's sexual pleasure, which includes caring about their feelings. It's interesting the conclusion she comes to. They're almost biblical. They're almost on target, right? She's very close. but oh, very far away. She's very close in that she understands how it is that God made her, even though she doesn't understand that God made her. She understands how her body works. But again, her conclusion is teach all these guys this so they learn how to satisfy the women, so the women can be equally satisfied. She misses the understanding that sex is not about pleasing yourself, it's about pleasing God and your spouse. Worship team, I'm going to invite you to come on up. You know, culture has this message, right? And it seems so appealing because these desires are so real, right? They're so powerful. They're so strong within us, and they do want to be experienced, and they do want to be felt, and it just seems like we should be able to express them. That's the flesh. That's that thing inside of us that's separated from God, that doesn't understand that living apart from God isn't the best way to live life. The flesh is separate. The flesh always lives separate from God. The flesh desires to be separate from God. We see in the garden in Genesis chapter 1 that the flesh was evident there and it disobeyed God. God said, I've put a tree in the garden. And the snake came along and said, did God really say you're not supposed to eat it? And the snake said to the woman, right, and the man, it looks good, it's pleasurable, it's satisfying, it's good for gaining wisdom. And they gave in. And they followed that, believing that little bit of truth was the truth and not what God said was the truth. Don't eat of it, because when you do, you're going to know good, and now you're going to know evil. Where are you at today? Are you pursuing a relationship with Jesus? Do you understand that he knows you, he made you? Or are you living according to the flesh? I invite you to open your life to God. For those of you who are followers of Jesus already, to renew that commitment to him, to be fully committed to him in your heart, your mind, and your body.
Kirk, I want to thank you and Joe for bringing this topic to us. It's a tough topic. But I applaud you for, approaching it head on, to speaking God's truth as found in his word. Would you all stand with us? And I like this last song here to be a response, our heart's response to these truths. trust you in your presence. I will live. My heart is yours. My heart is yours. Take it all. Take it all. My life in your hands. My heart is yours. My heart is yours. Take it all. Take it all. My life in your hands. Take it all. Take it all. My life in your hands.
I hope that song is true. And if you're struggling to figure that out, I'd be glad to help you understand what it means to give your life totally to Jesus. So today we wrap it up. It's done. We're not going to keep talking about this topic, although I'd gladly talk with you. Any questions that you have, feel free to email or whatever. Next week, we're going to begin a new series. See, because not only do we have bodies, but there are other parts of us, right? There's this thing called emotions. And so we're going to begin a new series next week. The title of it is Praying Through Your Emotions. So it's going to be a series about prayer, but also emotions. There's a lot of emotions that we have, and I hope that next week and throughout the summer as we look at the book of Psalms, it will be encouraging and helpful to us as we just go up and down in life. Hope Community Church, have a great week. Live a life that honors Jesus. See you next week.